The chainsaw's teeth snarled through redwood, a red mist of sawdust blooming in the crisp morning air. Ethan cut with a rhythm honed by years, a brutal, efficient dance between man and machine. Each fall was a small surrender, a removal of the deadwood that choked the forest's breathing space. He preferred it this way. Just him, the weight of the saw, and the ancient silence of the redwoods. It wasn't a life he'd chosen, not exactly. More a life that had been left to him after the choices had been made, after everything had fallen apart. He dropped another tree, the earth shuddering under its immense weight. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs, a scent that should have been comforting. It wasn't. Not anymore. Nothing was. He killed the saw, the sudden silence amplifying the chirping of unseen birds. He walked the perimeter of the fallen tree, assessing the clear path and planning his next cut. That is when he saw it. High on the trunk of a standing redwood, easily 20 feet above the forest floor, was a carving, not the haphazard scratching of initials or the clumsy heart and arrow of teenage lovers. This was deliberate, deep, intentional. The symbol was unlike anything he'd ever seen. A circle bisected by a jagged line, and within it, smaller, intricately woven shapes that seemed to shift and writhe even as he stared. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the work of someone passing time. It felt old and cold. He circled the tree, his gaze fixed on the carving. The redwood's bark was thick, resilient, almost impossible to penetrate without the proper tools. This carving wasn't made with a pocket knife. Someone had planned this, brought the right equipment. Someone had wanted to leave a mark. A prickle of unease ran down his spine. He'd spent enough time in these woods to know the subtle language of the forest. This symbol didn't belong. He ran a calloused hand over the rough bark surrounding the carving. It was clean, the edges sharp, recently made. He hadn't been through this section of the park in almost a month. How had he missed it? The image triggered a flicker, a momentary disorientation, a blinding flash of white, a voice, distorted and thin, calling out a name. Daniel. He blinked, the forest solidifying around him. Daniel. The name resonated with a dull ache in his chest, a phantom limb of regret. No. He shoved the memory down, forcing it back into the locked box where he kept all the others. He couldn't afford to go there. Not now. Not ever. He pulled out his radio, his fingers clumsy against the cold metal. He hesitated, reporting it felt wrong, like stirring up ghosts, but ignoring it felt worse. Reyes, this is Ethan. His voice was gravelly, unused to conversation. Static crackled for a moment before Ranger Lucia Reyes' voice came through, brisk and professional. Ethan, everything all right? I thought you were off-grid today. I am, just found something. Out near Blackwood Creek. What is it? He described the symbol, carefully choosing his words. It is a carving on a redwood. Not a typical vandalism thing. It is complex. A pause. A carving. Probably some hiker with too much time on their hands. Kids do that kind of thing all the time. If it is not causing damage, I wouldn't worry about it. It is not just a carving, Reyes. It is strange. It doesn't look like anything I've seen before. And it is deep. Someone really put effort into it. Look, Ethan, I'm dealing with a bear complaint near the visitor center and a downed power line on Skyline Drive. I don't have time to investigate every piece of artwork someone decides to leave in the forest. If it is not obstructing a trail or damaging a tree, let it be. He knew Reyes was right, logically. She was a pragmatist, focused on practical concerns. But that didn't ease the gnawing feeling in his gut. All right, he said, his voice flat. Just wanted to let you know. Appreciate it. Stay safe out there. He switched off the radio, the silence now oppressive. Reyes wouldn't understand. She hadn't been there. He remembered the search, the relentless days spent combing the steep, unforgiving terrain. the dwindling hope with each passing hour, the gnawing fear that had burrowed its way into his bones. Daniel Harding, a seasoned hiker, vanished without a trace 6 years ago. Ethan was the lead tracker, the best the park had to offer. He'd staked his reputation on bringing Daniel home. He hadn't. The trails had gone cold, the search had been called off, and Daniel had become another statistic, another name on a memorial plaque. The investigation had been thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. Accidental fall, wildlife encounter, suicide. The possibilities haunted the official report, but Ethan knew, deep down, that something else had happened, something they had missed. He'd felt it in his gut, a certainty that had eroded his confidence, his skill, his very sense of self. The press had been brutal. Tracker fails to find missing hiker. Park service under fire for slow response. He'd weathered the storm, but the damage was done. He'd been reassigned to maintenance, a quiet exile in the woods he once commanded, a punishment disguised as a transfer. He hadn't tracked a single person since. He felt his hands tremble as he wrapped them around the chainsaw again. The metal was cold, familiar. He needed to work, needed to lose himself in the physical exertion to drown out the rising tide of anxiety. He spent the rest of the day clearing trees, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. But the image of the carving burned behind his eyelids, the strange, unsettling shapes, the feeling that it was a sign, a warning, a message. He drove home in the fading light, the forest looming on either side of the road like a silent judge. He skipped dinner, barely registering the taste of the coffee he forced down. He tried to read, but the words swam on the page. He tried to sleep, but nightmares clawed at the edges of his consciousness. He tossed and turned, fragmented images flashing through his mind. Daniel's smiling face, the dense, claustrophobic forest, the symbol, twisting and turning like a living thing. He finally gave up, dragging himself out of bed before dawn. He needed to see it again, needed to confirm that he hadn't imagined it, needed to understand what he had overlooked. The drive back to Blackwood Creek was agonizingly slow, each turn in the road amplifying his apprehension. The forest was shrouded in mist, the trees ghostly and indistinct. He parked the truck and walked toward the redwood, his boots crunching on the damp forest floor. He stopped a few feet from the tree, his breath catching in his throat. The symbol wasn't alone. Below the original carving, another symbol had appeared, smaller but just as intricate, just as disturbing. It resembled a spiral, coiling inward toward a single, dark center. He stared, frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of it. 2 symbols, in 2 days. This wasn't random. This wasn't vandalism. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He wasn't alone. He slowly turned his head. Standing among the trees, partially hidden by the mist, was a figure, tall and gaunt, shrouded in dark clothing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. Its face obscured by the shadows. Ethan's hand instinctively went to his belt, where he used to carry his sidearm. Years on maintenance duty meant he hadn't worn it in a long time. It wasn't there. He had nothing to defend himself with. The figure raised a hand slowly, deliberately. In its grasp, something glinted in the dim light, something metallic, something small and sharp. And then the figure began to walk towards him. The figure hadn't rushed, it had simply moved, a relentless, silent advance that had stolen the air from Ethan's lungs. He'd backed away slowly, instinctively, until his spine pressed against the rough bark of another redwood. The figure stopped about 20 feet away, still shrouded in shadow. He could make out the glint of metal, now a small, folding knife, a detail that somehow felt more menacing than a gun. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted back into the mist and trees, leaving Ethan trembling and alone. He spent the rest of the morning in a state of heightened alert, scanning the woods with every nerve on edge. He eventually finished documenting the second symbol. sketching it in a worn notebook he always kept in his truck. The spiral felt wrong, like something pulling inward, consuming everything it touched. Back at his cabin, a ramshackle affair he'd inherited from his grandfather, Ethan traded the biting forest air for the stale smell of dust and old wood. He spread his research across the kitchen table, photocopies of Native American petroglyphs he'd found in a library archive, printouts of the symbol sketches, and a half-empty mug of lukewarm coffee. He focused on the circle and jagged line. The closest matches he found were in the folklore of the Yurok tribe, who had inhabited this region for centuries. The circle with a broken line often represented a disrupted balance, a warning against entering a sacred or dangerous space. The interwoven shapes within the circle were harder to decipher, but some interpretations suggested a protective ward meant to contain something, or to keep something out. It wasn't comforting. He needed more. He needed local knowledge. Old man Tiber lived on the outskirts of town, in a house crammed with relics and forgotten stories. Tiber hadn't worked a paying job in decades. He subsisted on Social Security and the occasional trade of information for a jar of Ethan's homemade blackberry jam. Symbols, you say? Tiber's voice rasped like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He peered at the sketches over the rim of his spectacles. Seen something like that before, faintly. Long time ago. Reminds me of the Harpers. The Harpers, Ethan prompted, already anticipating a long story. Old man Harper and his family lived up in the Blackwood Creek area, back in the 50s, vanished without a trace. Whole family. Husband, wife, little girl, Sarah, just gone. Tiber shook his head, the movement slow and deliberate. The sheriff at the time figured they'd run off, started a new life. But Harper was a solid man, rooted in this land. Wouldn't just up and leave. Did anyone ever find out what happened to them? Nope. Just whispers, folks said. The woods took 'em, that the land had a hunger. Some even talked about old rituals, things best left forgotten. Tiber paused, his gaze locking with Ethan's. Folks around here don't like to poke around in the past, son. Some things are better left buried. The name Sarah resonated like a discordant chord. He remembered it now dimly. It appeared briefly in the archived case file for Daniel Harding. Sarah Jenkins, the missing hiker. He excused himself, promising Tiber another jar of jam, and drove straight to the park headquarters. He hadn't looked at the Jenkins file in years. The memory of that failure felt like a weight in his chest. The files were dusty, but intact. He found the Jenkins case, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. Sarah Jenkins, 22, a student at Humboldt State University, had disappeared during a solo hiking trip in the Blackwood Creek area. She was researching local folklore for a paper. Her journal had been recovered, filled with notes on Native American legends and stories of the Harper family. He skimmed through the reports, searching for anything he might have missed. The initial search had been hampered by a late start to Sabine. She hadn't been reported missing for 3 days. He, been frustrated by her lack of planning, her insistence on venturing off trail. But something caught his eye, a sketch in her journal, hastily drawn in pencil. It was a crude rendition of a symbol. Not the circle and jagged line, but the spiral he'd found at the Redwood, and underneath, a single word, guardian. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. Sarah Jenkins had been looking for something, and whatever it was, it had led to her disappearance. He spent the afternoon mapping the locations where the symbols had been found, cross-referencing them with the areas Sarah Jenkins had frequented. According to her journal, a pattern began to emerge. The symbols weren't random. They were laid out in a line, leading deeper and deeper into the forest, towards an area known as Raven's Hollow, a notoriously treacherous section of the park rarely visited. He was packing his gear, preparing to follow the trail, when he saw the truck. A beat-up Ford pickup, parked across the street from his cabin. A man sat behind the wheel, watching him. Ethan stepped onto his porch, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. The man was weathered and hard, looking, with a scowl etched into his face. He recognized him, Jed Carlson, a local logger with a reputation for trouble. Carlson rolled down his window. "Heard you been asking questions about the Harpers." Ethan remained silent. "Let it go, Ethan. Some things are best left undisturbed. You start digging around in the past, you're gonna find things you don't want to see." Carlson's voice was low and menacing. "I'm just doing my job," Ethan said. His voice steady, despite the knot of fear tightening in his stomach. "Your job is clearing trees, not resurrecting old ghosts. You keep looking, you'll regret it." Carlson spat on the ground, then revved his engine, the sound echoing through the quiet neighborhood. He drove off, leaving Ethan staring after him, a sense of dread washing over him. He ignored Carlson's warning. He had to know. He had to find out what happened to the Harpers, and what Sarah Jenkins had been searching for, following the pattern of the symbols. He hiked deep into Raven's Hollow, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the ground spongy underfoot. The trees here were ancient, their branches gnarled and twisted like skeletal arms. He found the final symbol carved into the base of a massive oak tree, almost hidden by a tangle of vines. It was the circle and jagged line, but larger than the others, more intricate. It felt powerful. He used his compass to trace a line from the symbol, venturing off trail, pushing through thick undergrowth, and then he saw it. A cabin, overgrown with vines and moss, almost completely swallowed by the forest. The roof had partially collapsed. The windows were dark and empty. It had been abandoned for decades. He cautiously approached, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he carried now. He pushed open the rotting door, stepping inside. The air was stale and musty, filled with the smell of damp wood and forgotten things. The cabin was small, consisting of a single room. A dilapidated table and chair stood in the center of the floor. A rusted stove sat in the corner. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and stained. He began to search, carefully sifting through the debris. He found old newspapers, broken dishes, a child's worn-out teddy bear. And then, tucked inside a dusty trunk, he found a drawing, a crayon drawing on a piece of scrap paper, a colorful, childish depiction of the spiral symbol. He recognized it instantly. It was identical to a drawing found among Sarah Jenkins's belongings, the drawing she'd carried with her when she disappeared into these woods. The crayon drawing felt like a physical blow, a child's innocent hand reaching across decades, connecting Sarah Jenkins to the vanished Harper family. He held it up to the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was a warning, a plea. He resumed his search, meticulously combing through every inch of the cabin. The Harpers hadn't simply abandoned their lives, they'd fled. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink, clothes lay scattered on the floor. A half-finished game of checkers sat on the table. It was as if they'd expected to return any minute. He found a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, concealed by a loose rug. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, the pages filled with a spidery, frantic handwriting. The journal belonged to Eleanor Harper, the mother. The early entries were mundane, descriptions of daily life, observations of the forest, sketches of wildflowers. But as the months progressed, a disturbing shift occurred. Eleanor wrote of a growing fascination with the local folklore, particularly the Yurok legends of the spirits that dwelled within the Redwoods. She wrote of feeling a connection to the forest, a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced anywhere else. She described hearing whispers on the wind, seeing fleeting shadows out of the corner of her eye. She wrote of the forest calling to her. Then came the rituals. Small, harmless things at first, leaving offerings of food and flowers at the base of ancient trees. But they grew more elaborate, more strange. Eleanor described drawing symbols in the dirt, chanting ancient verses, attempting to communicate with the spirits. Her husband, Thomas Harper, began to express concern. Entries from his perspective, scribbled in the margins of Eleanor's pages, revealed a man increasingly alarmed by his wife's obsession. He dismissed the rituals as harmless eccentricity, but a growing unease crept into his writing. He worried about the influence of the forest, about the strange stories Eleanor had been uncovering. "She is losing herself in this," he wrote. "This place. It is changing her." The final entries were filled with fear. Eleanor wrote of a presence in the woods, a dark force that watched them from the shadows. She described nightmares, plagued by visions of twisting trees and malevolent eyes. She believed they were being hunted, pursued by something ancient and evil. The last entry, dated the 27th of October, 1953, was barely legible, scrawled in a shaky hand. "They, here. In the trees we have to protect Sarah. The spiral, it is a warning. Don't let them take her." The journal fell from Ethan's hand, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor. He felt a chill, despite the thickening afternoon heat. The spiral. The same spiral Sarah Jenkins had drawn. He flipped through the journal again, searching for anything he might have missed. Tucked between the final pages, he found a map, drawn on a piece of parchment. It depicted the surrounding forest, marking several locations with small, meticulously drawn symbols. And one location, circled in red ink, was a rocky outcropping known as Widow's Peak, overlooking Blackwood Creek. He recognized the pattern. The locations on the map corresponded with the places where he'd found the carved symbols. It was a trail, a path leading to something the Harpers had been desperately trying to protect themselves from. He spent the next few hours documenting everything, carefully photographing the journal and the map. The cabin felt oppressive now, suffocating. He needed to get out, to breathe fresh air. He was securing the cabin when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road. Ranger Reyes. She stepped out of her vehicle, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He explained about the cabin, about the journal, about the connection to the Harper family. He showed her the photographs, trying to convey the urgency he felt. Reyes listened patiently, her arms crossed. "This is quite a find, Ethan. But frankly, it sounds like a lot of speculation. Old family drama, local legends. It doesn't add up to much." "Sarah Jenkins was researching the Harpers," he said, emphasizing the connection. "She drew the same symbol. She disappeared in this forest. Sarah Jenkins's case went cold a long time ago," Reyes said, her voice firm. "There was no evidence of foul play. She likely got lost, had an accident. This cabin could have been abandoned for any number of reasons. But the symbols, Reyes, the pattern, it is not a coincidence." Reyes sighed. "I'll send a team to do a thorough search of the cabin, but I'm telling you, Ethan, you're chasing ghosts. Don't let this consume you." She and her team spent a few hours combing through the cabin, but found nothing conclusive. Reyes seemed determined to dismiss his concerns, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination. "See," she said as they were leaving. "Nothing here but dust and old memories. I suggest you focus on your job, Ethan, and stay away from Blackwood Creek." She drove off, leaving Ethan feeling frustrated and isolated. He knew he was onto something. He could feel it in his bones. But Reyes wasn't willing to listen. He spent the evening studying the map, tracing the path of the symbols. Widow's Peak was the final destination. He decided to stake it out, to see if anything happened. He arrived at Widow's Peak just before sunset, parking his truck a safe distance away and hiking to a secluded vantage point overlooking the rocky outcropping, a panorama of rolling hills and dense forest. But he wasn't there for the scenery. He settled into a concealed position, his senses on high alert. The forest was quiet, eerily so. Even the birds had fallen silent. As darkness descended, he saw a figure emerge from the trees. Tall and gaunt, shrouded in dark clothing, the figure moved with a deliberate, unsettling grace, heading directly towards the center of the rocky outcropping. He focused his binoculars, trying to get a clearer look. The figure stopped at a flat, smooth section of rock, and then, using a small, handheld tool, began to carve. He watched in horror as the figure etched a new symbol into the stone. The circle and jagged line, the same symbol that haunted his dreams, that connected Sarah Jenkins to the vanished Harper family. The figure wasn't just carving the symbol. He was performing a ritual, chanting in a low, guttural voice, his arms raised towards the darkening sky. He sprinkled a dark powder around the carving, the scent of incense carried on the wind. Ethan felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This wasn't just vandalism. This wasn't just a harmless eccentricity. This was something dark, something ancient, something evil. He reached for his radio, intending to call Reyes, but hesitated. What would he say? I'm watching a shadowy figure perform a ritual in the woods. He knew she wouldn't believe him. He continued to watch, transfixed by the disturbing scene unfolding before him. Then the figure stopped chanting, his head snapping up as if he'd sensed Ethan's presence. He slowly turned, his eyes locking onto Ethan's position across the clearing. A chilling smile spread across his face. And then he raised his hand, revealing a glint of metal, the small folding knife, and began to walk towards him. He didn't hesitate. Years of ingrained instinct, honed by a life spent navigating the unforgiving terrain of the Redwood National Park, took over. He scrambled down the rocky slope, adrenaline coursing through his veins, ignoring the sharp rocks that tore at his clothes and skin. The figure was closer now, moving with an unsettling fluidity, the knife held loosely in his hand. Ethan noticed his face in the fitful moonlight, fit, gaunt, pale, with eyes that burned with a fanatic gleam. Ethan yelled, his voice cracking with tension. Who are you? What are you doing? The figure didn't respond. He simply continued to advance, his pace unwavering. I said, stop. Ethan charged, aiming a shoulder check at the figure's torso. The figure sidestepped with surprising agility, deflecting the blow. Ethan stumbled, momentarily off balance. The figure seized the opportunity, slashing at him with the knife. Ethan recoiled, narrowly avoiding the blade. He felt a searing pain in his arm, a shallow cut that blossomed with blood. He ignored it, focusing on his attacker. Who are you? He demanded again, his voice raw. The figure finally spoke, his voice a low, rasping growl. Silas Harper. The name struck Ethan like a physical blow. A Harper, a descendant of the family who had vanished decades ago. What are you doing here? Finishing what my ancestors started, Silas said, his eyes burning with intensity. Awakening who? The guardian, the spirit of the forest, the one who remembers. Silas gestured towards the newly carved symbol. These markings, they are not meant to contain, they are meant to release, to break the seal. He began to chant again, his voice growing louder, more frantic. The wind picked up, swirling around them, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and indefinable. Ethan knew he had to stop him. He lunged again, attempting to disarm Silas. They grappled, rolling on the muddy ground, the knife flashing dangerously. Silas was surprisingly strong, his movements fueled by a manic energy. He wrestled Ethan to the ground, pinning him beneath his weight. He raised the knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. You don't understand, Silas hissed, his breath hot on Ethan's face. She has been imprisoned for too long. The land is dying. She needs to be free. Ethan kicked out, connecting with Silas's shin. Silas yelped, momentarily releasing his grip. Ethan scrambled to his feet, backing away. The rain started then, a cold, driving downpour that slicked the rocks and obscured his vision. It added another layer of difficulty to the fight, turning the terrain into a treacherous battlefield. He remembered something his grandfather had taught him. The forest always provides. He scanned his surroundings, searching for an advantage. A fallen log partially submerged in the mud. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He lured Silas towards the log, then sidestepped at the last moment, sending the bigger man crashing into the wood. Silas landed hard, his knife skittering across the rocks. Ethan pounced, grabbing the knife and throwing it into the dense undergrowth. He straddled Silas, pinning his arms to the ground. "It is over," Ethan said, his voice strained. "You're done." Silas laughed, a chilling, hollow sound. "You think you've stopped me? It has already begun. She is awakening." He struggled against Ethan's weight, his eyes fixed on the carved symbol. He continued to chant, his voice rising to a fever pitch. Ethan held on tight, desperate to subdue him, but the forest seemed to be resisting his efforts. The wind howled, whipping through the trees. The rain lashed down, blurring his vision. He felt a strange energy building in the air, a palpable sense of dread that seeped into his bones. The ground beneath him began to vibrate, a low rumble that intensified with each passing second. He glanced towards the center of the rocky outcropping. A colossal redwood tree, ancient and imposing, stood sentinel over the carving. It wasn't the wind that was causing the vibrations. The tree was moving. Its massive trunk creaked and groaned, as if straining against unseen restraints. Its branches swayed wildly, despite the lack of a strong breeze. And then, impossibly, its bark began to ripple, to breathe. Silas's chanting reached a crescendo, his eyes wild with religious fervor. The carved symbol began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. Ethan felt a primal fear grip his heart. This wasn't just a local legend. This wasn't just the delusion of a troubled man. Something ancient and powerful was stirring within the forest, something Silas Harper was determined to unleash. The ground trembled violently. Cracks appeared in the rock beneath their feet. The air crackled with energy. The redwood tree creaked and groaned again, its bark swelling and contracting. It looked as though it was waking from a centuries-long slumber. And then, a single, massive root erupted from the earth, near the base of the tree, thrashing like a living serpent. Silas threw his head back and let out a triumphant scream. She is awake. The air tasted like ozone and decay. The surge of energy radiated outward from the redwood, a wave of corrupted life force that slammed into Ethan with the force of a physical blow. He gasped, his vision blurring, his muscles seizing. A wave of nausea rolled over him, threatening to send him spiraling into unconsciousness. He managed to maintain his grip on Silas, but even that felt like a losing battle. The man thrashed beneath him, fueled by a manic joy, his eyes alight with a terrifying conviction. "She is here," Silas shrieked, his voice echoing through the now turbulent forest. "She remembers." Around them the forest was unraveling. Trees groaned in protest as their roots strained against the earth. The ground buckled and cracked, spewing forth plumes of steam and the sickly sweet smell of rot. Animals shrieked in terror, fleeing in panic disarray. A surge of energy arced from the redwood, striking a nearby pine tree. The tree instantly withered, its leaves turning black and brittle, its trunk crumbling into dust. Ethan realized with sickening certainty that this wasn't just a localized phenomenon. The energy was spreading, infecting everything it touched. He drove his knee into Silas's stomach, trying to regain control. Silas bucked violently, headbutting Ethan with brutal force. Ethan tasted blood, a metallic tang on his tongue. He staggered back, momentarily disoriented. Silas scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain, his gaze fixed on the pulsing redwood. He raised his arms towards the tree, chanting again, his voice now a guttural roar. "Mother, rise, claim your dominion. Purge this land of the trespassers." Ethan lunged, tackling Silas to the ground. They rolled across the uneven terrain, colliding with rocks and roots, momentarily silencing his chanting. But it did little to stop the escalating chaos. The tremors intensified. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy that made it difficult to breathe. Every nerve in Ethan's body screamed in protest. He felt a growing sense of helplessness, a terrifying awareness that he was facing something far beyond his comprehension. He heard the distant wail of sirens, growing louder with each passing second. Ranger Reyes. She had finally arrived. A convoy of Park Service vehicles screeched to a halt at the edge of the clearing. Reyes, looking grim and determined, emerged from the lead vehicle, accompanied by a team of armed rangers. "What the hell is going on here?" she shouted, her voice barely audible above the howling wind and the groaning trees. "Stand back," Ethan yelled, struggling to his feet. "This isn't just vandalism, it is something else." But it was too late. As Reyes and her team cautiously approached, a wave of energy erupted from the redwood, throwing them off their feet. One ranger was slammed against a tree, collapsing in a heap. Another was thrown several feet, landing with a sickening thud. "Reyes, fall back," Ethan shouted desperately. "It is not safe." Reyes, visibly shaken, waved her team back. She stared at the pulsing redwood, her face pale with disbelief. What is that?" she stammered. "I don't know," Ethan said, scrambling to his feet. "But we need to stop it." He remembered the journal, the counter-ritual. He had to find it, to decipher it, before it was too late. He fought his way through the chaos, dodging falling branches and leaping over fissures in the earth. Towards the spot where he dropped the Harper journal, he snatched it up, frantically flipping through the pages, ignoring the pain in his arm and the growing dread in his heart. The counter-ritual was scribbled in the margins of the final pages, written in a cryptic, almost indecipherable script. It spoke of a balancing act, of restoring the harmony, of a willing sacrifice. His blood ran cold. Sacrifice. What did that even mean? He scanned the entry, desperately searching for clarification. The writing was fragmented, elliptical, full of archaic symbolism. But one phrase stood out, repeating again and again. Life for life, a mirroring exchange. As he deciphered the journal, a sickening clarity dawned. The counter-ritual wasn't about performing a ceremony. It was about offering something of equal value to the entity, a life force to counteract the one it had awakened, a life force capable of grounding the entity. His gaze sweeping across the scene. Reyes was directing her team, trying to establish a perimeter to contain the escalating chaos. And then the entity shifted its attention. It wasn't a physical movement, but a focusing of energy, a direct acknowledgement of her presence. The redwoods pulsing light intensified, coalescing into a beam that fixed on Reyes. Reyes gasped, stumbling backward. She raised her hand, as if to ward off the energy, but it was too late. The beam enveloped her. And she froze, her eyes widening in terror. "Reyes!" Ethan screamed, scrambling towards her. But he was too far away, and something was holding him back. A powerful, unseen force that seemed to be pressing down on him, suffocating him. Silas, who had been struggling to his feet, let out a triumphant laugh. "She is the offering. The Guardian demands a balance." He watched in horror as an unearthly green glow emanated from Reyes, beginning to drain the color from her face. Her strength visibly ebbed, and she sunk to her knees, her eyes glazed over. He knew with chilling certainty that if he didn't do something, Reyes wouldn't survive. But the journal offered only one solution: a sacrifice, and the sacrifice had to be something deeply personal, something of equivalent value, something irrevocably connected to the natural world, to the spirit of the forest. His gaze fell on his father's old compass, hanging from a chain around his neck, a gift given to him the day he joined the park service, a symbol of his commitment to protecting these woods, and a reminder of the man who taught him everything he knew. A surge of anguish ripped through him. He'd carried that compass for over 20 years. It was more than just a tool. It was a part of him, but he knew what he had to do. His fingers trembled as he unclasped the chain around his neck. The compass felt heavy in his hand, cold and unforgiving. It wasn't his sacrifice to make, not truly. It belonged to Sarah Jenkins. It had been found amongst her belongings, a small, brass compass, worn smooth with use. Her journal spoke of its sentimental value. A gift from her grandfather, a seasoned explorer. She'd carried it on every hike, every adventure. It wasn't just a tool for navigation. It was a piece of her soul, and now he was going to surrender it. But it wasn't about him. It was about Reyes, about the forest, about stopping the entity before it consumed everything. He remembered Sarah, the fleeting glimpses he'd caught of her file, the youthful optimism in her photograph. She'd come here, drawn by the same mystery that now consumed him. She deserved a chance to rest, to be at peace. He carefully disassembled the compass, separating the needle and the glass face, the elements most likely to resonate with the energy of the counter-ritual. The rest he clutched in his palm, a tangible reminder of the price he was paying. He approached the area where Reyes lay, still fading, the green energy radiating from her body. Silas, babbling incoherently, was restrained by 2 rangers, struggling against their grip. He ignored Silas. He focused on the ritual, on the instructions scribbled in Eleanor Harper's frantic handwriting. He arranged the compass needle and glass face on a flat rock, forming a small circle, mirroring the larger carved symbol on the redwood. Then, closing his eyes, he channeled everything he knew about Sarah Jenkins, her passion for the forest, her love of exploration, her unfulfilled dreams. He imagined her spirit flowing into the compass pieces, imbuing them with her life force. He began to chant, not the guttural roar of Silas, but a low rhythmic murmur, drawing on the ancient rhythms of the forest. He wasn't summoning, he was offering. He wasn't demanding, he was pleading. "Return what you have taken," he chanted, his voice gaining strength. "Restore the balance. Let her rest." The air crackled with energy. The compass needle spun wildly, then settled, pointing directly towards the redwood. A beam of golden light erupted from the compass pieces, merging with the green energy surrounding Reyes. A shockwave reverberated through the forest, knocking Silas off his feet. The redwood groaned, its pulsing light flickering and dimming. The ground stopped trembling. Slowly, agonizingly, the green energy began to recede from Reyes' body. Her color returned, her breathing became steadier. She opened her eyes, blinking in confusion. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice weak. "You're safe," he said, his voice hoarse. The entity's influence waned with each passing second. The distorted energy dissipated, replaced by a sense of calm. The trees stopped groaning, the wind died down, and the animals tentatively emerged from their hiding places. Silas, now fully subdued, let out a wail of despair. No, she was meant to be free. "You've doomed us all." Reyes, slowly regaining her strength, gave the order to take Silas into custody. The rangers led him away, his cries echoing through the tranquil forest. Ethan remained by Reyes' side until a medical team arrived to assess her condition. She was weak and shaken, but she would recover. As the chaos subsided, Ethan found himself surrounded by grateful rangers. They praised his courage, his quick thinking, his willingness to risk his life. "You saved us all, Ethan," Reyes said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You saved this forest." He accepted their praise with a weary smile. It felt hollow. He knew he hadn't saved the forest. He'd merely delayed the inevitable. He'd stemmed the tide, but the roots of the problem remained. He looked at the redwood, its majestic form now bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. It stood silent and stoic, a witness to the events that had unfolded. He felt a profound sense of loss. He'd sacrificed a piece of himself, a connection to a young woman he'd never known, in order to contain the darkness. He'd earned a measure of redemption, but at a terrible cost. The forest felt different, now scarred but alive. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but the land retained a lingering sense of unease. The trees seemed to watch him with ancient, knowing eyes. He walked back towards the original carving, the circle and jagged line, examining it with a critical gaze. The scene was eerily calm, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves. He ran his hand over the smooth bark, feeling the weight of history, the echo of forgotten rituals, the lingering presence of a power he could barely comprehend. And then he saw it. Near the base of the tree, almost hidden by the tangled undergrowth, was a new carving, smaller than the others, crudely etched into the bark. It wasn't the circle and jagged line. It wasn't the spiral. It was something else. An unfamiliar symbol, a series of interlocking triangles, radiating outward from a central point. He'd never seen anything like it. It didn't match any of the Yurok petroglyphs he'd studied. It wasn't in Eleanor Harper's journal. It wasn't in Sarah Jenkins' notes. A cold dread crept into his heart. The silence of the forest suddenly felt oppressive. He felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unsettling feeling that he was being watched. He stood there, frozen, staring at the unfamiliar symbol, knowing that the battle wasn't over. It had merely entered a new phase. Something else was stirring in the woods, something older and far more dangerous.